In the garage, my own son shoved me hard. I hit the cold floor, my face scraped, my shoulder wrenched out of place. My daughter-in-law just smirked, saying I was acting like something out of a TV show. But just a few days earlier, he had taken out a massive life insurance policy on me without saying a word. My hands trembled, not from age, but from the cold truth flooding into my chest. I thought I knew what betrayal felt like, but this was different, sharper. If I stayed silent, what else would he take from me before I was gone? The push came out of nowhere. One moment I was stepping into the garage to grab an old box of holiday decorations, and the next, my son's hands were on my shoulders, shoving me so hard my back slammed against the concrete floor. The cold shot straight through my bones. Pain ripped through my arm as my shoulder twisted at an unnatural angle. My face scraped against the rough surface, leaving a sting that burned sharper than the winter air seeping through the open garage door. Before I could even try to sit up, I heard her voice. My daughter-in-law stood a few feet away, leaning against the car like she had all the time in the world. The corners of her mouth curled in a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. She said I was putting on a show, like some actress trying to win an award. That small, mocking laugh cut deeper than the injury. I pressed my good hand to the floor, steadying myself, feeling the tremble in my fingers. It wasn't from weakness. It was from something darker settling into my chest. Only a few days earlier, I had discovered something that still made my stomach tighten. My son had taken out a massive life insurance policy on me. He never mentioned it, never even hinted. I only found out because a letter from the insurance company arrived in my mailbox by mistake. The figure printed inside was so large it made me sit down at my kitchen table and stare at it for a long time. Back then, I told myself it might be a misunderstanding. Maybe there was a reason. But lying there on the garage floor with my arms screaming and my face raw, I knew better. This wasn't just a bad decision or a paperwork error. This was intentional, calculated. And now, every move he made felt like it was part of something bigger, something I wasn't meant to see until it was too late. I struggled to my feet, refusing to ask for help. My daughter-in-law's eyes followed me, cool and distant, like she was watching a scene she had already memorized. My son turned away, pretending to check something on the workbench, his silence louder than any accusation. I held my injured arm close to my body, the pain a steady reminder that I had crossed a line I didn't know existed. Walking back into the house, each step felt heavier. My mind ran through every moment of the past few months. Small arguments, strange glances, the way conversations would stop when I walked into the room. Things I had brushed off as stress or bad timing now seemed like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to finish. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, watching my hand shake as it gripped the glass. It wasn't fear of them that made me unsteady. It was the realization of how far they were willing to go. The insurance policy, the sudden hostility, the physical shove, it all connected in a way that made my chest tighten. For 73 years, I had believed that family, no matter how imperfect, was a bond that couldn't be broken without shattering everyone involved. But that belief was crumbling fast. My son and his wife didn't see me as family anymore. I was an asset, a line in a policy, a number. That night, I sat in my bedroom with the door locked, the lamp casting a soft light on the paperwork I had pulled from my desk drawer. My fingers traced over the edges of the envelope from the insurance company, the black ink still as sharp as the day I opened it. I thought about calling someone, telling them everything, but who would I trust enough? So I stayed quiet. For now. Not out of fear, but because I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I needed to know how deep this went before I made my move. If I had learned anything in my life, it was that you don't show your hand until you know the other player's game. As I sat there, the ache in my shoulder pulsing in time with my heartbeat, I promised myself one thing. This wouldn't end the way they thought it would. I might be older, I might be slower, but I wasn't powerless. And if they believed otherwise, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. If you've ever been blindsided by someone you thought you could trust, you know that moment when your world tilts and nothing feels steady anymore. That was me in the garage that day, and that was the day I started planning. The morning after the garage incident, my shoulder was stiff and swollen. I kept my arm close to my side as I made coffee, every movement sending a dull ache down my back. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, but the silence felt heavy. My son had left early, and my daughter-in-law was still upstairs. That gave me a small window to think clearly without their eyes on me. I went to the dining table and spread out a stack of documents I had been avoiding for weeks. Bank statements, property deeds, old letters from my late husband's attorney. I had kept these papers neatly filed away, untouched, because I never thought I would need them in a fight against my own family. Now, I saw them differently. They weren't just records. They were proof of a life I had built long before my son and his wife decided who I should be. The first thing I noticed was a withdrawal I didn't authorize. It was small enough not to trigger alarms, but it was the second time this month. I traced the account number and realized it was linked to a joint account I had opened years ago for emergency purposes. My son had access. I felt my jaw tighten. This wasn't carelessness, it was testing boundaries. I called the bank and spoke with a clerk I trusted, a woman who had helped me for years. She confirmed what I suspected. There had been attempts to access other accounts as well, ones with higher balances. The system had flagged the attempts, but hadn't yet blocked them. I told her to freeze every account under my name until I came in person. My voice was steady, but inside I felt a rush of urgency. After hanging up, I sat still for a moment, letting the reality settle. This was no longer about the shove in the garage or a cruel laugh. This was about control. My son and his wife weren't waiting for me to fade away. They were taking steps to make sure that when I did, they would already have everything in their hands. Later that afternoon, I heard the front door open and close. My son's footsteps moved through the hallway, then into the kitchen. He didn't look at me. Instead, he went straight to the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. I caught a glimpse of his face. Calm, almost indifferent. It struck me how easily he could switch between cold hostility and casual routine. I excused myself and went upstairs, locking the door behind me. In my bedroom, I pulled a small safe from the back of the closet. Inside were 2 USB drives and a manila envelope. The drives held scanned copies of all my financial records, insurance policies, and property documents. The envelope contained the originals of my most important papers. I had made these backups years ago, but now they felt like lifelines. By evening, I had decided to take a trip to the attorney's office the next day. My plan wasn't fully formed yet, but I knew I needed legal advice before making any move. I didn't trust that my son and his wife wouldn't notice, so I left my purse by the front door and took only a small shoulder bag with the documents. I wanted them to think I was going to the grocery store or the library, nothing more. The next morning, I parked 2 blocks from the attorney's office and walked the rest of the way. The crisp air cleared my head. Inside, the receptionist recognized me and ushered me into a quiet room. My attorney, a man who had handled my affairs for over a decade, listened carefully as I laid out what I had discovered. His expression didn't change much, but when I mentioned the life insurance policy, he leaned back slightly and took a long breath. He explained my options. We could restructure my assets so they would be out of reach without my explicit consent. We could also set up a trust that bypassed my son entirely if anything happened to me. It would take time and discretion, but it was possible. The thought of moving forward with these changes felt both empowering and heavy. I had always wanted my son to inherit something meaningful. Now I was preparing to keep it from him entirely. When I left the office, I kept the documents in my bag, close to my side. On the walk back to my car, I felt the weight of each step. This was no longer just a family conflict. It was a quiet battle, and I was choosing to fight it without announcing a single move. That night, I made myself a simple dinner and sat at the kitchen table. My son and his wife were in the living room, the sound of the television filling the air. I ate slowly, listening to the faint hum of their voices blending with the program on screen. They didn't look at me, and I didn't look at them. We were under the same roof, but the distance between us had never been greater. I knew this was just the beginning. The next steps would have to be precise, timed carefully, and hidden in plain sight. Every choice I made from now on would have to protect what I had left, not just for myself, but for the principle that my life's work would not be reduced to a transaction in someone else's plan. 2 days after meeting with my attorney, I began quietly putting the plan into motion. I woke up earlier than usual and waited until the house was still, no footsteps above me, no sound of water running. I slipped on a coat, tucked my small shoulder bag close, and left through the side door. My first stop was the bank. The manager, a woman I had known for years, greeted me warmly but noticed my serious expression. I handed her the paperwork my attorney had prepared and asked her to move certain accounts into a trust under his legal oversight. She didn't ask questions. Within an hour, my most significant savings were no longer directly tied to my name. From the bank, I walked to the notary's office to finalize additional documents. I made sure each page was stamped and witnessed. Every signature felt like another layer of protection, another wall between me and the people living under my roof. By the time I left, the sun was higher, and I knew my absence at home would soon be noticed. I stopped at a small market and bought bread and apples, letting the grocery bag disguise the real reason for my trip. When I returned, my son was in the driveway, leaning against his car. His arms were crossed, and his eyes scanned me in a way that felt more like an inspection than concern. I walked past him without breaking stride, carrying the bag into the kitchen. The silence between us was sharp, heavy with unspoken suspicion. I set the groceries on the counter, washed my hands, and went to my room. That afternoon, I began removing personal items from shared spaces: family photos, important letters, small heirlooms, anything that held value beyond money. I stored them in a locked trunk in my closet. I moved with quiet purpose, listening for any sound from the hallway. My hands were steady, but inside, my thoughts were a tangle of calculation and anticipation. By evening, I had one more errand to run. I called a taxi from the back porch and had it pick me up 2 streets over. I asked the driver to take me to a storage facility on the edge of town. I had rented a small unit there under a different mailing address, something I had arranged years ago for seasonal furniture. That night, it became my safeguard. I transferred several boxes of personal records, a few small valuables, and the locked trunk into the unit. I left with the only key in my pocket. The following morning, the atmosphere in the house shifted. My daughter-in-law moved through the kitchen with clipped steps, her eyes flicking toward me but never meeting mine. My son barely spoke. They knew something had changed, even if they couldn't name it yet. I kept my routine simple: making tea, reading at the table, stepping outside to water the plants, offering nothing that might hint at my movements. Later that week, A letter arrived addressed to me, but my daughter-in-law brought it into the living room and opened it without hesitation. I watched from the hallway as she unfolded the paper, her brow furrowing. When she noticed me, she held it up with a smirk. It was from the insurance company, confirming adjustments to a policy. I walked in calmly, took the letter from her hand, and folded it without a word. Her eyes followed me as I left the room. That night, I could hear them speaking in low voices behind closed doors. Every so often, the volume rose, and my name slipped through. The walls in this house carried sound too well. I didn't need to hear the whole conversation to know they were recalculating whatever plan they had set in motion. 2 days later, my attorney called to confirm that the trust had been fully activated and my will updated. The new arrangement bypassed my son entirely unless certain conditions were met, conditions I knew he would never fulfill. The rest was directed toward a community foundation I had chosen quietly, an organization that supported women rebuilding their lives after loss. It felt fitting, almost poetic, to turn what they saw as an easy gain into something that would help strangers instead. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I sat at my desk, reviewing each document one last time before locking them away. The fight wasn't over. My son and his wife would sense the change more and more in the days ahead, and they would react. But I had taken the first real step toward securing what they could no longer touch. That evening, as I was washing dishes, my son came into the kitchen. He reached for a glass from the cupboard and filled it with water. His movements were deliberate, his voice casual as he mentioned that he had been reviewing some paperwork from the house. I dried my hands slowly, waiting. He glanced at me, searching for a reaction I didn't give. The silence stretched between us before he finally walked out, leaving the glass half full on the counter. In that moment, I understood the quiet power of restraint. I didn't need to confront him or announce what I had done. My protection was in the layers he couldn't see, the decisions he would only discover when it was too late to undo them. Every step I took from now on would be measured, deliberate, and without warning. The house felt different that night. The tension was still there, but beneath it, I felt a steady current of control returning to me. I had acted without asking for permission, without offering explanation. That was the first time in a long while that I had done something entirely for myself, and it would not be the last. I woke the next morning to the sound of rain tapping against the kitchen window. It was still early, but my mind was already sorting through what needed to be done. The trust was secure, the important documents were locked away, and the most personal belongings were out of the house. Now came the part that required more than just preparation. This was about control. Quiet, deliberate control over what they could be and could not do to me. I began with the utilities. Sitting at my small desk, I called each company, one after another, removing my name from accounts tied to the house. I set final billing dates, transferring what was mine to my new address. It felt almost clinical, but I knew the effect it would have. When they realized the electric bill or water bill was suddenly theirs alone, there would be questions. I did not intend to answer them. From there, I moved to the bank accounts. Some were joint in name only, opened years ago for convenience. Those days were gone. I withdrew the remaining balances, leaving the accounts active but empty. No notes, no warnings, just silence where they expected access. I kept the funds separate, tucked into new accounts in my name only. At a bank across town, they rarely drove past. The rain had slowed by midday, and I decided it was time to check the mailbox. On my way down the driveway, I saw my son standing near the garage, his hands deep in his pockets, eyes on me. He said nothing, and I matched his silence, walking past him without a pause. There was a momentary shift in his posture, a small tightening of his jaw, as though he wanted to speak but decided not to. That was when I realized he might have already noticed the changes. Back inside, I opened the day's mail. Among the usual junk was a letter from the insurance company, addressed to me but clearly opened and resealed. The crease was uneven, and the glue tacky. My stomach knotted. I placed the letter aside without reading it, making a note to request digital-only correspondence. No more paper trails they could intercept. By late afternoon, I was ready for the next step. I contacted my attorney and scheduled a meeting to finalize the secondary will. The main trust would secure the bulk of my estate, but this document would serve as a precise map for smaller assets they might try to claim. Jewelry, family heirlooms, even the antique desk in the living room that had belonged to my grandmother. I wanted no ambiguity. When I arrived at the attorney's office the next day, we went line by line through the list. She asked if I wanted to remove certain beneficiaries entirely. I nodded. There was no reason to leave open doors for people who had shown me nothing but contempt. We also discussed medical directives, an uncomfortable but necessary topic. I was determined to ensure no one who wished me harm would have any say in my care. The drive home felt longer than usual. As I turned into the street, I saw a delivery truck in front of the house. My daughter-in-law stood at the door, signing for a large box. Her face was bright with the kind of satisfaction that comes from spending freely. I parked farther down and waited until the truck pulled away before walking in. She gave me a glance that lingered just a second too long, as though measuring my reaction. I gave her none. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The house felt different now. Not warmer, not safer, but no longer entirely theirs. I had drawn invisible lines they could not cross without effort. They did not yet know where those lines were, and that gave me time. Time to solidify every safeguard. In the following days, I began shifting the rhythm of the house. Small, almost imperceptible changes. I locked doors I used to leave open. I kept my bedroom key on me at all times. I rearranged storage so certain boxes were no longer where they expected them to be. These were not just defensive moves. They were a way of reclaiming space, of reminding myself that I was not powerless. One afternoon, I overheard them in the living room. My son's voice was low but strained, and I caught fragments about bank records and account closures. My daughter-in-law's reply was sharp, layered with frustration. They had noticed, and their unease was beginning to grow. I stayed out of sight, heart steady, knowing the plan was working exactly as intended. By the end of the week, I had completed every major step I had planned. The trust was locked, the accounts secured, the will updated, and the property under my control had been reduced to what I could protect. I had not raised my voice, not confronted them openly, and yet the ground beneath them had shifted. They could feel it, even if they could not see the full extent. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about the weeks ahead. They would push back. I knew it was only a matter of time before their frustration turned into action. But I also knew that each move I made from here on would be on my terms. They had underestimated me, believing age and silence were signs of weakness. In truth, they were cover, a shield behind which I could move freely, piece by piece, until everything that mattered was out of their reach. I closed my eyes with a sense of calm I had not felt in months. The storm had not passed, but I had built walls high enough to withstand it. And when the next wave came, I would be ready. The morning began with the kind of sharp sunlight that made every corner of the house feel exposed. I moved quietly, not because I was hiding, but because I had learned that silence carried more weight than confrontation. The more I kept to myself, the more they seemed to watch me, unsure of what I might do next. That uncertainty was part of my plan. I focused on the documents spread out on the dining table. They were in neat stacks, each marked with a small slip of paper in my handwriting. These were not just records. They were evidence of every step I had taken to make sure my future was mine alone. Account statements, updated beneficiary forms, property deeds. I kept copies in two separate places, one locked in my desk and another with my attorney. By mid-morning, I was ready to leave for my meeting with a financial advisor I had trusted for years. It had been months since we last spoke, but he understood my way of thinking. The drive into town was quiet, the roads still wet from the night's rain. When I arrived, he welcomed me into his office and we got straight to the point. I told him I wanted to create an additional safety net, something layered beyond the trust and the accounts I had already secured. We discussed options, and I settled on a portfolio that would be entirely separate from my main holdings. It would be harder for anyone to trace, set under a legal structure that required multiple verifications to access. He assured me it could be done quickly, and I left feeling lighter. When I returned home, I found my daughter-in-law in the kitchen, her phone in one hand and a stack of mail in the other. She gave me a smile that did not reach her eyes. I noticed a letter from the bank among the envelopes. Without asking, she slid it into a drawer, as though it belonged there. I let it happen, making a mental note to move my correspondence to a secure P.O. box before the week was out. That afternoon, I started on the house itself. The locks on the side entrance were old, and I arranged for a locksmith to replace them. While he worked, I walked through each room, noting what should be moved and what could be left behind without regret. Some items held value only to me, memories woven into the fabric of my life. Those would be packed away soon. As the day faded, I received a call from my attorney. She had completed the updates to the will and wanted me to review them before signing. The list of removed names was longer than I had expected, but it felt right. No one who had treated me with cruelty would benefit from what I had built. The next morning brought a change in the air. My son's car was gone when I woke, but my daughter-in-law remained. She lingered in the hallway outside my bedroom for a few seconds too long before moving on. Later, I heard her on the phone in the living room, her voice tight, speaking in quick bursts. I caught fragments about accounts being closed and funds disappearing. I spent the afternoon at the bank, finalizing the transfer of the new portfolio. Everything was in motion now, each piece fitting into place. By the time I returned home, the tension inside the house had grown thicker. They were beginning to realize that whatever grip they thought they had on me was slipping. That evening, I cooked a small dinner for myself and ate it in the sunroom. Through the glass, I could see the faint reflection of my own face. The lines were deeper now, but my eyes were steady. I thought about the months ahead and the certainty that more challenges would come. I did not fear them. Each move I made was calculated, deliberate. Over the next few days, I kept to my rhythm: appointments, quiet walks, small errands. I spoke little, but I observed everything. My daughter-in-law began spending more time in my son's office, the door closed. Once I passed by and heard the clicking of keys, the sound of frustration in her sighs. The final step that week was to secure a safe deposit box at the new bank. Inside it, I placed the most critical documents, the backup copies of every agreement, and a small envelope containing a letter only to be opened if something happened to me. It detailed the truth of what had been done, the choices I had made, and where to find everything they could not touch. By the end of the week, I felt the balance shift. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I could sense it. They no longer looked at me with the same dismissive ease. There was a guardedness now, a flicker of uncertainty every time our paths crossed. They were realizing, perhaps too late, that they had underestimated me. I knew this was not the end. It was only one stage in a longer game. But I also knew that with every quiet, deliberate step, I was reclaiming the ground I had once surrendered. The house might still hold their presence, but my life was no longer in their hands. And that, more than anything, was the kind of freedom they would never be able to take back. The next week began with a steady rain that tapped against the windows before dawn. The sound followed me through the house as I moved from room to room, keeping my steps light, as if the walls themselves were listening. Every detail mattered now, and every choice had to be made with precision. I started with the upstairs storage. Boxes had been stacked there for years, many untouched since before my husband passed. Some held old photographs. Others were filled with papers that would mean nothing to anyone else, but could be dangerous in the wrong hands. I worked slowly, sorting and pulling out anything that should be moved to the safe deposit box. Each item was a reminder that I had lived a full life long before the tension in this house began. By mid-morning, I had 3 sealed containers ready. They were light enough for me to carry, but their contents were worth far more than their weight. I locked them in my car before heading to the attorney's office for a follow-up. She greeted me with the same calm, steady manner she always had, and we reviewed the updated legal arrangements. Her eyes scanned each page before sliding it toward me for a signature. The will was airtight now, with clauses that made it nearly impossible for anyone to contest. The trust had been expanded to include my new investments, and the ownership of my small rental property was officially shifted under a separate entity. It was as if I had built invisible walls around everything that was mine. When I returned home, my son's car was in the driveway. Inside, I could hear low voices from the living room. I passed by without slowing, catching only a fragment about expenses and accounts. I knew they were starting to feel the weight of my withdrawal. Where they had once expected me to provide, now they found closed doors and unanswered questions. I spent the afternoon at the bank again, moving the sealed containers into the safe deposit box. The clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, chatted politely as she handled the paperwork. I left with the keys secure in my pocket and the quiet comfort of knowing those items were now beyond reach. Back at the house, the atmosphere had shifted. My daughter-in-law kept herself busy in the kitchen, moving with sharp, quick gestures. My son avoided eye contact, retreating to his office. I prepared a simple dinner for myself and ate in the den, the television playing low in the background. The quiet felt heavier than usual, like something was building just beyond my view. The next morning, I called a contractor I had worked with years ago. He agreed to come by to inspect the small cottage on the edge of town that I had recently put under my name. The plan was to make it livable within weeks. It was not large, but it was mine, and it would be free of the constant undercurrent of hostility I felt here. The inspection went well, and by the afternoon, I had a list of repairs and a timeline. It would take careful coordination, but I could be ready to move sooner than they expected. That thought brought me a quiet satisfaction. Later that day, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone again. Her tone was sharper now, impatient. She mentioned delays, locked accounts, and legal notices. I could almost picture her pacing in frustration. My son's voice joined hers a moment later, lower and steadier, but laced with irritation. I let their words wash over me without reaction. Their confusion was proof that my strategy was working. That evening, I reviewed my final checklist. The trust documents were filed, the investments secured, the property in progress. The safe deposit box held everything critical. I had shifted the center of control away from them entirely, and they were only beginning to realize it. The rain returned that night, heavier this time. As it fell against the roof, I lay awake, thinking of how far I had come in just a few weeks. I had entered this house feeling like an outsider in my own life. Now, I was quietly reclaiming each piece of it, step by deliberate step. The next morning brought a small but telling moment. My son asked about a bill that had come in the mail, one that in the past I would have paid without hesitation. I told him it was his responsibility now. His face tightened, but he said nothing. The shift in power was not loud or dramatic, but it was there, settling into place like the steady rhythm of the rain outside. By the end of the week, I knew I was nearing the point where I could step away completely. There was no need for confrontation. My absence would speak louder than any argument. And when I closed the door for the last time, I would take with me everything they had assumed would always be theirs. The sky cleared after days of rain. A pale blue stretched thin over the neighborhood. I took that as a sign to move on the next piece of my plan. The financial groundwork was set. The house was no longer an open door. Now I needed clarity from the place where the first real crack had opened. The insurance company. I drove across town with a folder in my bag and a calm I had practiced. The lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that lives in carpet and fluorescent light. A receptionist checked my identification and directed me to a small conference room. I asked for a full audit of any policy with my name as the insured. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain why. I simply requested the record. A compliance officer joined me with a neat stack of documents. He read my name, verified my address, and confirmed that a policy was active. He described it in precise terms. A life policy with a $1 million face value, an accidental death rider for $250,000. Issue date 11 months ago. Owner and primary beneficiary listed under my daughter-in-law. Premiums paid by a card number ending in the same 4 digits I had seen on my son's statements. I kept my hands folded and listened for the small details that tell the larger truth. He slid a consent form across the table. The signature flowed in an uneven curve I recognized immediately as wrong. I am right-handed. The strokes on that page leaned left, heavy at the bottom, as if produced by a hand trying to imitate another. The notary stamp belonged to a storefront office on the far side of town. I had never been there. The officer took notes as I stated that I had not signed that form and had not authorized any third party to sign for me. We moved to the recorded call log. There was a notation of a verification call to a number listed as mine, made during a weekday afternoon when I had been at the clinic for a scheduled appointment. The call lasted 3 minutes. The voice on record answered security questions using my birth month, the street where I grew up, the last 4 digits of an old landline. Information a family member would know. The officer marked the entry for review. He explained the next steps in measured language. A fraud review could be opened. The policy could be placed under hold, pending investigation. Any claim filed during that hold would trigger an immediate referral to the State Insurance Board. I agreed to cooperate fully and authorized release of relevant information to law enforcement. He photocopied my identification and the pages with the questionable signature. When we finished, he handed me a case number and said the internal team would reach out within 48 hours. Outside, the air felt cooler. I sat in my car for a moment and breathed in through my nose, out through my mouth, letting the muscles in my shoulders loosen. This was the first official step that did not rely on me alone. A system larger than my kitchen and my locked drawers was now aware. I did not feel vindicated. I felt steady. My next stop was the notary address listed under the stamp. It was a narrow office wedged between a payday lender and a cell phone repair shop. The clerk at the counter looked up as I entered and asked what I needed notarized. I asked instead to view the notary log for the date on my consent form. She hesitated, then called to the back. A man came out with a ledger and set it down between us. I scanned the page. My name appeared next to an entry that included a misspelled version of my street. The signature of the notary matched the stamp on my form. The identification used was listed as a state ID card. I do not own one. I carry a driver license. The clerk watched me as I copied the line into my notebook. I thanked them and left without comment. On the sidewalk, I called my attorney and relayed what I had found. She told me to head to her office and to bring the notes. When I arrived, we organized the pieces. Policy summary, forged consent, notary log discrepancy, recorded call at a time I could document elsewhere. She drafted a formal complaint to the state insurance regulator and prepared a packet for the local district attorney. She recommended contacting a detective she had worked with in prior fraud cases. I agreed. By late afternoon, I sat in a small office at the precinct across from a detective with a calm voice and a careful pen. She listened as I outlined the timeline, starting with the shove in the garage and ending with the conference room that morning. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she asked for copies of the bank alerts and any correspondence that had gone missing or arrived opened. I provided what I had and signed the consent forms required for the department to request records from the insurer. She said they would begin by confirming the notary entry and pulling any surveillance from the office on the date listed in the ledger. Driving home, I noticed my hands had stopped trembling. They lay relaxed on the wheel. The road felt familiar. The houses felt smaller. The fear that had lived at the base of my skull eased into something firmer. Not anger, not relief, something like alignment. The facts now stood beside me. Inside the house, the air was tight. My son was on the phone in the hallway, speaking in clipped sentences. My daughter-in-law sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her screen with quick, precise motions. I moved past them to the sink and washed my hands, letting the water run until it cooled. I dried them slowly. I sensed their attention shift, then slide away when I offered nothing to catch it. That evening, I organized a copy set of everything created that day and placed it in the safe deposit box on my way to the grocery store. On the return trip, I drove by the small cottage and parked for a minute with the engine off. The roofline was plain. The yard needed trimming. It looked exactly like a place where a person could begin again without anyone else's permission. Back at home, I made a simple meal and cleaned the kitchen before heading to my room. I sat at my desk and wrote the date at the top of a page. Then I listed each milestone from the morning. Policy hold initiated, forged consent documented, notary irregularity logged, law enforcement notified. For months, my days had been defined by quiet retreat. Today, something new had entered the story, a line none of them had drawn. I slipped the page into a folder and turned off the lamp. The house settled around me with its usual creaks and sighs. Outside, the last light faded over the street. I lay down with a steady breath and let the stillness cover me. The next move would not be loud. It did not need to be. The truth was now in motion, and I had no intention of stepping out of its way. The cold arrived fast that week, the kind that slicks the porch before sunrise and turns every step into a calculation. By late afternoon, the forecast called for a hard freeze. I noted the hour and the temperature on the page where I kept my timeline, then set the notebook on my dresser. The detective had asked me to keep my routine steady. No sudden changes, no nervous pacing, no doors slammed. If they moved tonight, the house needed to look familiar. Near dusk, I watered the plants in the sunroom and left the back porch light on. From the street, the house would read as it always did. A soft lamp in the den, the television volume low, a plate drying on the rack by the sink. Inside, small adjustments waited like quiet anchors. The phone by my bed fully charged. the spare key removed from the hook near the door. The path from my room to the kitchen cleared of any rug that might slide underfoot. I had learned the hard way how easily a fall can be staged. At 7, my sister called from her car outside the neighborhood. She kept her voice even. The detective and her team were in place. An unmarked car at the corner, another one 2 streets over. The neighbor with the doorbell camera had already tested his motion alert and confirmed the angle on my driveway. If movement happened near the garage, the lens would see it. I moved through the next hour as if it were any other evening. I pulled a blanket over my knees in the den and sipped tea that I made myself from a bag I opened. My son came in from the cold and stood at the threshold long enough to let the air bite my ankles. He walked to the kitchen without a word. My daughter-in-law followed later, shoes leaving a neat line of water at the back door. I heard cabinets open, a glass set on the counter, the faint snap of a bottle cap. I kept my eyes on the screen and let the scene play behind me. The detective had told me that the most dangerous moment comes when a plan meets a deadline. Pressure gathers, mistakes multiply, and the pattern shows itself. By 8:30, my son's steps had changed. No wandering, no pauses, straight lines from the garage to the kitchen and back again. My daughter-in-law moved in half circles, touching the counter, the car keys, the hall table. She spoke in low bursts that carried only rhythm, not words. They were aligning pieces and checking for small snags. I stood and stretched as if I needed the bathroom, then took the route the detective and I had walked earlier. The hallway light stayed on. My door stayed slightly open. When I reached my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened. The garage door groaned up, then down. The heater kicked on and pushed warm air through the vent at my feet. Somewhere near the sink, water ran for a few seconds and stopped. I counted to 60 and picked up the phone. My sister answered on the first ring. She said she was calling to confirm the food pantry schedule for the morning. Her real message was simpler. The unit at the corner had eyes on the driveway. The team across from the alley had a clear view of the garage door. At 9, a knock sounded at the side entrance off the mudroom. Not loud, not meant for me. A voice I did not recognize carried a few consonants and then fell away. The door opened and clicked shut. A set of footsteps that did not belong to my family crossed the tile, careful and quick. The detective had warned me about outside help. A driver to move a car at the right moment. A lookout to text a signal. A fixer who knows how to angle a story once the damage is done. I waited another full minute, then walked back toward the kitchen, letting my footsteps land where they usually did. My daughter-in-law had her back to me. On the counter beside her, a glass of water sat closer to the edge than I would ever place it. My son stood in the garage doorway with his hand on the frame, as if he were holding up the house. I could smell the cold coming through the open crack. I could also smell a faint sweetness rising off the glass. Not mint, not citrus. It was the same trace I remembered from the night my shoulder gave way. I passed the glass without touching it and rinsed my mug in the sink. The garbage disposal hummed. The back porch light painted a rectangle on the floor. My daughter-in-law moved her hand toward the glass and then away again. My sister called at that exact moment and spoke clearly through the speaker about a church list she needed to confirm. Her voice reached every corner of the kitchen. My son looked at the phone and then at the garage. A tilt in his body told me the timing had shifted inside his head. Outside, a car door eased shut. The neighbor's camera would have caught that. Inside, the third set of footsteps returned from the mudroom and stopped just short of the doorway. I could feel a tension stack up behind me like air before a storm. Movement slowed, then narrowed to a point. This is the moment that leaves marks whether or not it finishes the way it was drawn. I set the mug to dry, wiped my hands on a towel, and stepped to the side, out of the narrow corridor between the island and the doorway. The detective had taught me that a person trying to stage a fall prefers a lane with hard edges, counter corner, door frame, stair tread. I chose the open tile and kept my weight over my feet. The next 30 seconds stretched long enough for every sense to sharpen. A phone vibrated against wood. A message arrived. My son exhaled and shifted toward the garage. My daughter-in-law slid the glass closer to where my hand would naturally reach. The outside steps creaked near the side entrance. The porch light I had left on turned the wet boards into a warning. From the street, tires crunched over ice and stopped. The sound was soft but final. I saw my daughter-in-law's eyes flick toward the window, then back to the glass. My son took one step, then another, tightening the space between us to a distance I recognized from the night in the garage. I held still and let the silence expand. In that silence, I heard the answer to a line I had been writing for months. They were ready. So was I. A knock came from the front door, not the side entrance, not the casual tap of a neighbor. 3 firm, even strikes that carried through the hallway into the kitchen. My son froze in place. The third set of footsteps retreated fast. My daughter-in-law's hand closed over the glass and moved it back from the edge as if it had never been there. I stepped away from the center of the room and walked toward the den with the pace of a woman who hears nothing unusual. Down the hall, voices identified themselves in steady tones that carried authority and patience. The house shifted the way a house does when a storm reaches it and then pauses. I stood in the doorway of the den and watched the porch light lay its white square on the floor. The night outside held its breath. Inside, the plan that had been tightening for weeks loosened by a single degree. The next move had arrived, and it did not belong to them anymore. By the time the evening arrived, the air in the house felt dense, heavy with something unspoken. The long dining table had been set, the silverware polished until it caught the soft light overhead. I had been told, rather firmly, to come early, which was unusual. My son greeted me with a fixed smile that did not reach his eyes. His wife, Melanie, stayed in the background, whispering to her sister in the kitchen. There was a rhythm to the way they moved together, like they had been rehearsing for this moment. Guests began to arrive. Some were family, some were business acquaintances of my son. He played the role of gracious host, shaking hands and laughing loudly. I noticed how he avoided standing too close to me, making sure our conversations stayed brief and polite. The undercurrent was unmistakable. Something was building. My instincts told me I would not like what was coming. The first part of the evening went smoothly on the surface. Glasses clinked, small talk filled the air, and the roast in the oven gave off a rich aroma. But I caught Melanie glancing at me several times, her mouth curving into a faint, knowing smirk before she turned away. At one point, her sister brought me a plate and remarked, with a sweetness that felt like vinegar, that I should enjoy this dinner while I still could. It was an odd comment, and I filed it away quietly. When the main course was served, my son stood at the head of the table. He cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. He began with a short speech about family, about transitions, about the importance of making decisions for the future. The words were polished, the kind you might hear at a corporate meeting. Then his tone shifted, firm and deliberate. He spoke of changes in the family structure, about responsibilities being passed to those who were better positioned to handle them. It was then that he said my name, announcing in front of everyone that I would no longer be part of certain family holdings or decisions. He framed it as a natural progression, one that would allow me to rest and enjoy my later years without burdens. The phrasing was gentle, but the meaning was not. In one breath, He was publicly cutting me off from influence and control over what I had built and protected for decades. The room was silent, except for the clinking of a fork against a plate. I kept my face still, my posture straight. I would not give him or Melanie the satisfaction of seeing me falter. Inside, though, my chest felt tight, the weight of betrayal pressing down. I thought of the conversations we had in this very house years ago, when he promised to honor my efforts, to protect what mattered. Those promises were ashes now. Melanie took the opportunity to stand and announce a few practical details, speaking as if she were chairing a meeting. She mentioned new signatories, revised bank access, and a planned transfer of certain assets. The way she said it, you would think she was announcing the dessert menu. Every sentence was a reminder that this had been organized, agreed upon, and finalized long before I stepped into the room. I felt the eyes of the guests on me, some curious, some uncomfortable, a few clearly aware of what had been planned. There was no place for outrage here. I understood that reacting in the moment would only give them more ground. Instead, I nodded, as if this were all expected, and reached for my glass of water. My hand was steady. I would not let them see the fracture. As the dinner moved on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, though the tone was forced. My son seemed relieved to have made the announcement, his smile easier now. Melanie kept a close watch on me, likely hoping for a slip, a comment, anything that could be used against me later. She got nothing. I spoke only when spoken to, offering brief, polite replies. When the evening ended, I thanked the guests near me, took my coat, and walked to the door without waiting for either of them to say goodbye. Outside, the night air was cool, the kind that sharpens your thoughts. I stood for a moment, listening to the muffled laughter from inside. They thought this was the end of my influence. They believed they had taken the final piece from me. But what they did not know, and what I had no intention of revealing yet, was that I had already prepared my own set of documents. Quietly, carefully, over the past months, I had secured the core of what truly mattered to me, moving it beyond their reach. They had staged their public victory tonight, but it was built on a foundation of assumptions, and assumptions can crumble. I walked to my car, my steps measured, my mind already working. This dinner had not been a defeat. It had been confirmation. Now I knew exactly where the lines were drawn, and I intended to hold my ground without them ever seeing the strike coming. Their stage-managed announcement was just the opening act. Mine would come later, and it would leave no room for them to rewrite the ending. The morning after the dinner, I woke with a clarity I had not felt in months. There was no fog of doubt left, no wondering about intentions. They had shown me exactly what they were capable of, and in that certainty, there was power. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, letting my thoughts take shape into action. The plan I had been shaping in fragments would now take its full form. The first step was to meet with the one person I trusted implicitly, my attorney, Ruth. She had been with me through difficult chapters before and knew how to separate emotion from strategy. By midday, I was sitting in her office, a stack of organized folders in my lap. Ruth listened as I laid out the events of the dinner, my voice steady, my recollection exact. She asked for timelines, dates, and every document related to my holdings. I handed her copies I had prepared long before last night. I had learned the value of being ready for a storm before the clouds appeared. She examined each page carefully, occasionally making notes. When she was done, she leaned back, her eyes meeting mine with a measured focus. She explained how their recent moves could be countered, not loudly or in confrontation, but through a quiet redirection of authority. The key would be to leverage the provisions already in place, ones they likely had overlooked. They had been so focused on the public show of removing me from certain decisions that they had missed the quiet language buried deep in older agreements. Over the next few days, Ruth and I worked methodically. We reviewed every trust document, every joint account, every property deed. I had assets they knew about, and others they had no reason to suspect existed. Years of careful planning had left me with holdings under different legal structures, some intentionally distant from the family's core portfolio. What they had tried to strip from me was only the surface. Part of the plan involved reinforcing alliances with people they assumed were neutral. I began making calls to old contacts, business partners, property managers, even a banker who had handled my accounts for decades. I spoke plainly, sharing only what was necessary, and secured verbal commitments for the steps ahead. None of these moves were grand gestures. They were precise, deliberate adjustments to ensure my position remained intact where it mattered most. As I moved through each day, I made sure my outward demeanor remained unchanged. When I saw my son and Melanie in passing, I greeted them with the same calm politeness as before. I knew that keeping them comfortable in their belief that they had succeeded was an advantage. The more secure they felt, the less they would look for what I was doing behind the scenes. One evening, I attended a charity event I had supported for years. Several influential people were there, including a member of the board from a foundation my family had ties with. In casual conversation, I hinted at shifting my contributions in a new direction, toward initiatives I could personally oversee. The message was subtle, but clear to those who understood the dynamics. My resources were being repositioned under my own guidance, outside of my son's reach. The more I moved, the more I realized how much of my strength came from simply not reacting on their terms. They had set the stage for a public removal, expecting me to fight in the open where they could control the narrative. Instead, I had chosen the quieter route, reshaping the structure they thought they controlled, without giving them a single dramatic scene to exploit. By the end of the week, Ruth had finalized the key legal adjustments. Certain accounts had new beneficiaries, property titles were reaffirmed under my sole name, and trust provisions had been clarified to prevent unauthorized access. Each change was executed cleanly, leaving no trace for them to interpret as an act of retaliation. It was, on the surface, nothing more than prudent financial housekeeping. When all the steps were in place, I felt a calm settle over me. I had not stopped what they did at the dinner table, but I had made it irrelevant. They could have their symbolic victory, their announcement, their applause from the guests. What they did not have, and now could never take, was the real control they had been aiming for. That weekend, I visited one of the properties they did not know I still managed. It was a modest coastal retreat, tucked away from the family's usual circle. Standing on the porch, watching the tide roll in, I thought about the years ahead. I would not waste them on bitterness. My focus would be on living fully and protecting the independence I had reclaimed. They might believe they had written me out of the story, but the truth was that I had simply chosen to write the next chapters myself. The silence of the ocean felt like an ally, steady and unyielding. I knew the time would come when they realized what I had done, and when that day arrived, it would be clear that their carefully staged dinner had not ended my influence. It had only given me the clarity to secure it forever. The first signs that the structure had shifted came in small, practical ways. A notice from the bank confirming updated beneficiaries, a certified letter from the county recorder, acknowledging the reaffirmed title on the cottage, an email from the foundation board accepting my revised gift designation. None of it was dramatic. All of it was final. I kept my days measured. Breakfast at the same hour, a walk around the block after the mail arrived, calls with Ruth in the afternoon to close loops one by one. We moved through a list that left little room for interpretation. Rescind any prior informal permissions. Replace every legacy contact with the current designations. File the affidavits that documented the forged consent and the irregular notary entry. Open a parallel file with the state insurance regulator so that nothing could be quietly reversed. When the last legal packet was couriered, I turned to the house. The locksmith returned to finish what we had started. Side entrance, mudroom, garage interior door. Bedroom, new hardware, new keys, a tidy envelope labelled with discreet tags. I kept the primary set on a ring in my pocket and placed a spare in a small lockbox at the cottage. The work took an hour. The quiet afterward felt like a room exhaling. The next task was the boundary I had avoided naming out loud. Ruth had prepared the paperwork for a no-contact order that covered me and the cottage address. The petition did not accuse for effect. It documented dates, medical notes, bank logs, the policy audit, the conference room meeting, the night of the knock at the door. I read each line twice before signing. Filing it did not feel like punishment. It felt like closing a gate that had been left unlatched for too long. By midweek, the transport was scheduled. A small moving crew arrived just after sunrise. I had already packed the essentials into sturdy containers with plain labels. Books actually read. Kitchen tools I trusted. The lap blanket I kept by the den chair. A single case of family photos, chosen carefully. The rest would remain until a later date under the supervision of a property manager Ruth recommended. The crew worked efficiently, carrying boxes down the front steps while I marked a short inventory on a clipboard. In less than 2 hours, the truck was loaded and the doors latched. I followed in my car to the cottage. The air felt lighter as the road opened along the edge of town. At the cottage, I unlocked the front door and stood for a moment in the small entry, listening to the stillness. The crew brought the boxes inside and set them in neat stacks. I tipped them and watched the truck roll away. The quiet that remained was not empty. It was clean. I spent the afternoon arranging only what I needed for the night. Sheets washed and pulled tight. Towels folded on the chair. A single lamp in the corner with a warm bulb. I heated soup on the stove and ate at the small table by the window. The view was ordinary. A maple tree, a short fence, a neighbour's mailbox across the street. Ordinary felt exactly right. That evening, Ruth called with the final confirmation. The no-contact order had been granted on a temporary basis pending a full hearing. The trust amendments were recorded. The insurance fraud review had advanced to the next stage with formal cooperation from the detective. We also activated the piece I had chosen weeks ago, but kept close until now. The fund. Years ago, I had set aside a modest sum intended for something different. With Ruth's guidance, I restructured it into a dedicated fund under a local non-profit. The purpose was simple and specific. Transportation vouchers and accompaniment for older women attending medical appointments, court hearings, or critical errands. The seed amount was $100,000 with a plan for replenishment through a percentage of rental income from the cottage once repairs on the back unit were finished. The fund administrator sent over the first set of procedures and a calendar for quarterly reporting. Reading those pages steadied me. Money could be a quiet tool when pointed at a precise fracture. The next morning, I returned to the house briefly with the property manager to complete an intake walk. We documented the condition of each room, photographed fixtures, and took meter readings. My son was not there. Melanie kept to the hallway, her expression bright and brittle. I said nothing beyond what was required to complete the checklist. When we finished, I handed the manager the final key and the folder with service contacts. He would be the one to coordinate access from now on. At the cottage, I set a small routine. Morning notes, a short stretch, coffee by the window. calls with the contractor about the back unit, a visit to the bank to place additional originals in the safe deposit box, a stop at the non-profit to sign the donor acknowledgement and meet the program lead who would oversee the voucher distribution. She spoke with the kind of steady focus that reminds you why certain choices matter. I left the office with a brochure in my pocket and a sense that something good had been set in motion beyond my own life. Late in the week, I received a court notice with the date for the full hearing. I placed it in the front of my binder and closed the cover. I did not rehearse what I would say. The record already spoke for me. In the quiet of the cottage, I stood at the sink, washing a single plate, and let the warm water run over my hands. The road ahead did not feel easy. It felt navigable. There is a difference. Night settled early. I stepped onto the small porch and listened to the branches lift in a thin wind. Behind me, the rooms glowed with soft light. I thought of the long stretch between the garage floor and this doorway. The papers filed, the locks changed, the fund established. None of it erased what had happened. It did something sturdier. It marked where my life resumed on my terms. I went back inside, turned off the lamp, and let the house settle around me. The boundary was now written into keys and ledgers and court calendars. It was not a threat. It was a shape. And inside that shape, I could finally breathe. The final morning of winter carried a trace of lingering cold, but inside me there was a rare stillness. I stood at the window, watching the first sunlight spill across the bare branches outside. The house was mine now, truly mine. No more heavy footsteps in the hall, no more voices cutting through my meals, only quiet space, the sound of water beginning to boil, and the warm scent of coffee filling the air. I thought back on everything I had endured over the past few months. The betrayal from my own blood, the cold stares, the words that cut like glass. Every wound had taught me something. Never to rely on someone else's approval to keep standing. I realized I didn't need to prove my worth to people who had already decided to erase me. Instead, I rebuilt my world piece by piece, with steady hands and a clear mind. That day, I stopped by the community center where the Women's Support Fund I had created had been running for a month. The faces of single mothers lit up when they saw me, their handshakes warm, their thanks sincere. They didn't know my full story, but they understood one thing. Someone had believed in them and given them a chance, and that, in turn, was a gift I had given myself. In the afternoon, I returned home and opened the cabinet to take out a folder stamped finalized. Every legal document was complete. No loopholes left, no room for manipulation or baseless demands. The people who once thought they could control me now had to face the fact that they held no power here anymore. I felt no gloating, but I carried no regret either. A page had been turned and I had no intention of looking back. As the sun dipped behind the hills, I sat out on the porch, a light blanket around my shoulders, watching the sky fade into a soft violet. The dry leaves whispered like a song bidding winter farewell. I could feel it in my bones. I had walked through the storm, and what remained was quiet strength. No noise, no display, just the deep knowledge that I was exactly where I was meant to be, as my truest self. Tomorrow would be just another day. But to me, every day now carried a new meaning. I had reclaimed the right to decide my own life. I had walked away from hollow parties and empty connections, and instead chosen to stand beside those who valued my presence. That was the greatest reward I could ever give myself. This story isn't just about loss or legal wins. It's about taking back the right to live life on your own terms, one choice at a time. I believe we all carry a kind of strength we don't see until life forces us to find it. Have you ever had a moment when you realized you were far stronger than you thought? If this story stirred that feeling in you, share it with others so we can remind each other that even after the hardest storms, there is always a way forward. Strength is quiet, but it changes everything.